At 3:17 in the morning, while Wagadougou slept under a blanket of silence, a phone rang. Not a call of friendship, not a call of diplomacy, but a call of coercion. On the line was Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, delivering not an invitation to dialogue, but an ultimatum. 48 hours, just 2 days for Captain Ibrahim Traoré to choose between surrender and survival. Restore the suspended mining contracts, reopen the channels of surveillance cooperation, submit to foreign dictates, or prepare to be crushed beneath the weight of global pressure. My brothers and sisters, this was no ordinary midnight conversation. This was not diplomacy dressed in silk. This was blackmail wrapped in the cloak of international politics. A demand that Africa's wealth be treated not as a blessing for its people, but as a bargaining chip in foreign hands. And the price tag placed on Burkina Faso's dignity, $1.2 billion. A 1.2B mining deal that for others represented profit, but for the people of this land represented sovereignty stripped away. But the question that hangs over us tonight is larger than one phone call, larger than one deal, larger than one nation. Can a continent that has endured centuries of intrusion, exploitation, and betrayal finally declare with one voice that its dignity is not for sale? Netanyahu gave Traoré 48 hours. 48 hours to abandon independence or stand tall against intimidation. And so, my friends, let us walk together into the heart of this story, not as distant observers, but as witnesses to a struggle that echoes through time. Because what began at 3:17 a.m. in Ouagadougou may yet become a turning point for Africa and perhaps for the world. Stay with me, and before we reach the end, I invite you, subscribe now, because this story of defiance, this story of dignity, is one you cannot afford to miss. At 3:17 a.m., a sound pierced the stillness of Wagadougou. A telephone rang in the residence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. It was not a diplomat extending courtesy. It was not a neighbor offering brotherhood. On the other end of the line, thousands of miles away, Benjamin Netanyahu's voice carried not words of dialogue, but the cold steel of an ultimatum. 48 hours, the voice declared. Restore our suspended mining contracts, reopen our surveillance cooperation, or face the consequences. My brothers and sisters, let us pause here. 48 hours. Just 2 rotations of the earth, not to reflect, not to consult, not to negotiate, but to surrender. This was not an offer. This was not diplomacy. This was the language of intimidation, the echo of old colonial habits disguised as modern politics. Netanyahu's demand was clear. Hand back control over a 1.2B mining deal, a deal that enriched outsiders far more than the citizens of Burkina Faso. For him, it was a transaction. For Traoré, it was a question of dignity. Would he trade away his people's sovereignty for survival, or would he stand firm even if it meant hardship? In the dim light of that early morning, Traoré listened, his jaw set, his silence heavy. When the line went dead, he did not collapse in fear. He did not call for retreat. He called his ministers. Within the hour, the long wooden table in the presidential compound filled with stern faces, the Minister of Defense, the heads of intelligence, the Chief of Foreign Affairs. Their eyes betrayed no panic, only a grave understanding. The storm had arrived. As the recording of Netanyahu's voice replayed in the chamber, the words weighed like chains. 48 hours. Leave or surrender. The silence that followed was deafening. For several minutes, no one spoke. Each man and woman around that table understood that this was not merely about contracts, not merely about surveillance channels. This was about the very principle of sovereignty. Finally, an intelligence officer broke the silence. "This is not about gold or cooperation," he said. "This is about dismantling our independence." Heads nodded slowly. They all knew the truth. History had shown it time and again. When Africa's leaders resisted external demands, they were not met with dialogue, but with destabilization, with economic pressure, with rumors and unrest whispered into being by invisible hands. And so the question was placed on the table: resign or resist? If Traoré stepped down, foreign contracts worth billions would be restored. The world would sigh in relief. The markets would stabilize. But what of the people? What of the dignity of a nation told to kneel on command? If he resisted, the cost would be severe. Sanctions that could slash Burkina Faso's GDP by 4 to 6% annually. Capital flight that could drain reserves by hundreds of millions. Cyber sabotage, propaganda campaigns, political isolation. The arsenal of 21st century warfare, deployed without a single bullet fired. The defense minister leaned forward, his voice steady. "Dependence is already killing us slowly. To step down now would not save us. It would bury us." His words carried the weight of truth. For years, Burkina Faso had exported its riches, yet its people lived on less than $3 a day. If survival meant endless submission, was it survival at all? Around the table, ministers wrestled not with policy, but with destiny. They recalled names that still echoed across Africa's soil. Patrice Lumumba, cut down for daring to dream of independence. Thomas Sankara, silenced for daring to speak of self-reliance. Each story a warning, each name a reminder. Yet something in the room was different. This was no longer the Africa of decades past. Across the Sahel, nations were rising, Niger, Mali, choosing defiance over obedience. Could Burkina Faso now join that chorus of resistance? The debate stretched deep into the night. Charts were shown, figures analyzed, risks calculated. Economists painted grim projections. Yet the air carried more than numbers. It carried a spirit, an unspoken conviction that freedom cannot be measured in percentages or GDP. And when Captain Traoré finally rose to speak, his words cut through the haze of doubt. "I do not negotiate with extortionists," he declared. His voice was calm, not raging, but resolute. "Sovereignty is not a bargaining chip. Better to die standing than to live on our knees." Those words, my friends, were not merely rhetoric. They were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. In that moment, the young leader of Burkina Faso transformed what could have been a humiliating ultimatum into a test of principle. But make no mistake, the test had only begun. Outside that chamber, forces were already moving. Analysts in foreign capitals were preparing sanctions lists. Diplomats whispered of regime change. Media outlets sharpened their narratives. The 48-hour countdown had started ticking, and every minute carried the weight of uncertainty. The ultimatum could crush him, or it could awaken something far greater than one man's resolve. And so, the question looms. As the clock ticks closer to midnight, will Traoré bow to pressure, or will his defiance spark a movement that reshapes Africa's fight for independence? When dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the ultimatum still hung in the air like a storm cloud. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not shaken. He stood before his ministers, before his soldiers, before his people, and spoke words that would echo far beyond the walls of the presidential compound. "I do not negotiate with extortionists." My friends, that sentence carried more force than any weapon. It was not anger that moved him. It was clarity. In those few words, Traoré transformed what was meant to be a private humiliation into a public declaration. He reminded the world that sovereignty is not a currency to be exchanged, not a contract to be signed, not a token to be handed away. It is the lifeblood of a nation. But words alone could not shield a country. He knew this. His advisors knew this. The clock was still ticking. 48 hours. Pressure would come, not just in whispers, but in sanctions and sabotage, in narratives painted across international media. And so, before the sun had fully risen, Traoré began to weave what few had expected, a network of resistance that stretched far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. A call was placed to Caracas. Venezuela, long familiar with the sting of Western pressure, extended its hand. "You will not stand alone," came the reply. Offers of safe haven, political solidarity, a reminder that defiance can find shelter in the arms of those who have walked the same path. From Tehran came another lifeline. Experts in digital defense, in cybersecurity, in the shadow war of information, prepared to shield Burkina Faso's fragile financial systems from sabotage. Analysts warned that without such protection, cyber attacks could erase $500 million in banking flows annually. But with Iran's guidance, the nation gained armor for the digital battlefield. From Moscow, quiet but strategic support arrived. Military advisors, logistical planners, voices that understood the silent pressure campaigns designed to suffocate a nation before a shot was ever fired. Russia did not promise to fight Burkina Faso's battles, but it promised to strengthen its spine. From Beijing came the most powerful lever of all, economics. A promise of alternative trade routes, credit facilities, and the possibility of a $1 billion emergency line of support, enough to stabilize Burkina Faso's reserves for 18 months. Time, precious time to weather the storm. But, brothers and sisters, the most powerful answer did not come from foreign capitals. It came from the streets of Wagadougou itself. When word of Netanyahu's ultimatum leaked, it did not sow fear. It ignited unity. Students abandoned their classrooms. Farmers left their fields. Women in marketplaces banged pots and pans, turning rhythm into resistance. Shopkeepers shuttered their stalls not in retreat, but to march alongside laborers, chanting the same cry, "Sovereignty is not for sale." In a country where nearly 40% live below the poverty line, where survival often means choosing between food and shelter, these people declared something greater. Dignity is worth more than dollars. The chants grew louder, filling the night air. "We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv." Banners stretched across streets. Graffiti etched into walls bore the number 48, not as a symbol of fear, but as a badge of pride. What Netanyahu had framed as a private ultimatum became a public reckoning. International observers were stunned. The African Union, usually slow to move, convened an emergency session. Diplomats in New York and Brussels whispered of instability, yet what they were witnessing was not collapse, but consolidation. A small nation, long dismissed as fragile, had discovered its voice. But make no mistake, the threats were real. Foreign intelligence services did not sleep. Disinformation campaigns flooded social media, painting Traoré as reckless. Cyber attacks probed government servers. Banks began freezing accounts worth tens of millions. The arsenal of coercion was being loaded, ready to fire. And so the question sharpened. Would Burkina Faso's alliances abroad and solidarity at home be enough to hold the line? Or were these gestures, powerful but fleeting, against the full machinery of global pressure? For every step forward, the risks multiplied. For every ally gained, new enemies stirred. The countdown continued. The 48 hours ticked away. And as the second day loomed, the question on every tongue was no longer just about Traoré. It was about Africa itself. Would this act of defiance be remembered as reckless bravado, or as the spark that lit a fire across the continent? The flames of resistance had been kindled. But now came the test. Would they be strong enough to withstand the storm about to descend? The moment Netanyahu's ultimatum struck the airwaves, the countdown began. 48 hours. Not a day more, not a moment longer. Radios crackled with speculation. Newspapers carried headlines of looming crisis. International markets wavered, uncertain whether a small nation could withstand the weight of a giant. In Ouagadougou, tension thickened like the air before a storm. Families whispered in hushed tones. Traders in the markets asked each other, will they come? Will sanctions fall? Will our leader bend? And yet, in the same breath, another answer rose. We will not be sold. Economists, both at home and abroad, drew their calculations. If Israel's demands were resisted, sanctions could strip Burkina Faso of hundreds of millions annually. GDP could fall by 4 to 6% each year. Reserves might drain. Banking flows could be disrupted by $500 million through digital sabotage. Analysts in Western capitals predicted collapse, insisting that resistance was reckless. But on the streets, another narrative was forming. People who survived on less than $3 a day gathered in public squares, not with fear, but with fire. Students painted banners that read, "Sovereignty first." Market women banged their pots, turning ordinary cookware into drums of defiance. Construction workers left their scaffolds to march shoulder to shoulder with farmers fresh from the fields. And their chant thundered through the capital. We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv. This was not just protest. It was a declaration of dignity. For decades, foreign contracts had promised wealth but delivered little. The so-called 1.2B mining deal had filled the pockets of outsiders, while the average Burkina Faso family saw none of its riches. Now, confronted with the ultimatum, the people made their choice clear. Better hardship with dignity than wealth under submission. The African Union, startled by the rising tide, convened an emergency session. Leaders from Niger, Mali, and Ghana debated late into the night. Some feared that Burkina Faso's defiance would bring destabilization across the Sahel. Others declared it a turning point, proof that Africa was ready to stand together. The phrase Wagadougou Effect began to appear in foreign journals, describing the sudden unity forged by the ultimatum. In Europe, diplomats wondered aloud, would sanctions crush this nation, or would sanctions once again backfire, fueling unity instead of compliance? In Washington, silence was heavy. American officials watched carefully, knowing that if Burkina Faso stood firm, others might follow. Meanwhile, the 48 hours crept forward. At the 24th hour, rumors spread that Israeli diplomats sought back-channel talks, a sign that the tone of confidence was shifting. At the 36th hour, analysts warned that sanctions could cost Burkina Faso $500 million in trade and aid. Yet the people did not waver. Families gathered in prayer. Students held vigils. Elders told their children, dignity is more valuable than gold. At the 45th hour, a shift became visible. Tel Aviv's language softened. Threats of force were replaced with hints of dialogue. Yet Captain Traoré did not flinch. He stood before cameras and declared in simple, unwavering words, Burkina Faso does not surrender. No riddles, no hesitation, just clarity. And then, my friends, midnight struck. The 48th hour arrived. The world held its breath. Would planes appear in the sky? Would sanctions thunder down? Would the streets of Ouagadougou descend into chaos? But instead, silence. An extraordinary silence. No soldiers marched. No bombs fell. No final statement came from Tel Aviv. The ultimatum dissolved, not in blood, but in retreat. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was more than survival. It was victory. A victory of spirit over fear. A victory of dignity over coercion. A small nation where millions live below the poverty line had stared down a global power and stood taller than before. Yet even in celebration, another question loomed. For if Burkina Faso, one of Africa's smallest economies, could resist in the face of pressure, what might happen if the entire continent united under the same banner? The ultimatum was meant to break them. Instead, it ignited something larger. But now came the test beyond 48 hours. Would this unity last? Or would it fade once the storm passed? When the silence of the 48th hour settled over Wagadougou, the world leaned in. What was supposed to be the breaking of a nation became the strengthening of its resolve. And suddenly, every capital, from Washington to Brussels, from Addis Ababa to Beijing, was asking the same question. What just happened? In Washington, officials huddled behind closed doors. Some whispered that Traoré's defiance was reckless, a gamble that could isolate Burkina Faso. But others quietly admitted the truth. If such a small nation could stand firm against pressure, the dominoes might begin to fall. Niger, Mali, Chad, who might be next? The fear was not only about Burkina Faso, it was about the precedent. In Brussels, European analysts worried about contracts, investments, and supply lines. Billions tied to African resources suddenly looked fragile. If one leader could freeze a 1.2B mining deal, what would prevent others from tearing up agreements signed under unequal terms? Investors recalculated risk. Energy companies revised forecasts. The tremor in Ouagadougou rippled through global markets. But in Africa, the mood was different. The African Union, often criticized for hesitation, moved swiftly. An emergency session gave birth to a landmark declaration. Sovereignty cannot be negotiated under duress. For the first time, Africa's leaders spoke not in vague resolutions, but in binding language. The ultimatum had not divided them. It had unified them. Scholars began to call it the Wagadougou Effect, the realization that dependency is not destiny, and that intimidation can spark unity instead of surrender. From Accra to Bamako, from Lagos to Johannesburg, civil society movements rose. Students marched with Burkinabe flags. Parliamentarians debated resolutions condemning foreign coercion. Artists painted murals of defiance, inscribing the number 48 across city walls. What was meant to be a countdown to surrender had become a badge of honor, a symbol of hope. And yet, my friends, as the celebration spread, so did the warnings. Analysts cautioned that pressure does not vanish overnight. Sanctions can still come. Disinformation can still corrode. Isolation can still suffocate. The silence after the ultimatum may have been victory, but it may also have been the calm before another storm. So the question stands, is this truly the dawn of a new era for Africa, or is it only a fleeting moment before the machinery of global power regroups and strikes again? The silence that greeted the 48th hour was not empty. It was full of relief, full of pride, full of awakening. In Ouagadougou, the people who had prayed, marched, and shouted together now stood taller. Their nation had not been broken. It had endured, and in that endurance, a new story began to write itself. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the ultimatum's end was not just a personal victory. It was a national declaration. Burkina Faso would not be managed by threats. And for Africa, it was proof that sovereignty, once defended, multiplies beyond borders. The African Union moved swiftly, faster than many expected. Out of emergency debates came a bold creation, the Wagadougou Protocol. For the first time, African nations pledged collective defense against political coercion. A strike against one would be answered by many. Some called it Africa's own Article 5, not born in Washington or Brussels, but on African soil by African will. From that foundation, projects once seen as dreams gathered new urgency. Talk of an African monetary union grew louder. Economists calculated that a common currency, backed by the continent's gold, oil, and cobalt, could save billions in transaction costs and shield Africa from the volatility of foreign currencies. Engineers spoke of satellite networks to cut dependence on Western telecommunications. Scholars envisioned academies to train leaders who would resist the temptations of neo-colonial contracts. But, my brothers and sisters, the power of those 48 hours reached far beyond parliaments and boardrooms. It seeped into culture. In Lagos, musicians released songs blending Afrobeat with chants of sovereignty. In Accra, graffiti artists sprayed 48 across city walls, transforming fear into pride. In Ouagadougou, filmmakers began capturing the story, preparing to turn resistance into memory. Even schoolchildren in playgrounds shouted the number as a game, proof that history had etched itself into the next generation. Globally, too, the resonance grew. In Caracas and La Paz, activists launched campaigns titled Sovereignty First. In Manila and Jakarta, voices pointed to the Wagadougou Protocol as a sign that the Global South could resist dictates. Analysts in Washington and Brussels, once dismissive, admitted privately that the ultimatum had weakened Western leverage in regions long treated as dependent spheres. And yet, beneath the pride, a question lingered. For even as Burkina Faso adapted, rerouting banking channels, resisting disinformation, reinforcing unity, the forces arrayed against it had not vanished. Sanctions may still come. Digital attacks may still intensify. Pressure may still return, harder and heavier than before. So, the true test lies not in the victory of those 48 hours, but in what follows. Will Africa seize this moment, building institutions strong enough to turn defiance into lasting independence? Or will the fire of solidarity so bright today fade once the immediate threat has passed? The clock struck midnight once before. It may strike again. The question is, next time, will Africa be ready? The story of those 48 hours is no longer just Burkina Faso's story. It is a story of principle, of dignity, of sovereignty defended in the crucible of pressure. What began with a midnight call meant to intimidate ended with a nation standing taller than ever before. Netanyahu gave Traoré 48 hours, yet instead of bending, he turned that countdown into a statement for the ages. The world expected surrender. Instead, it witnessed defiance. The 1.2B mining deal was not restored. The contract stayed frozen, and what was meant to prove Africa's weakness became a testament to its strength. For every threat whispered from abroad, a louder chorus rose from the streets of Ouagadougou. Sovereignty is not negotiable. And here, my friends, lies the greater truth. Intimidation is temporary, but dignity once claimed cannot be undone. Netanyahu gave Traoré 48, but in those hours, something far larger was born. The people of Burkina Faso showed that courage is more contagious than fear, that unity can break the chains of dependency, that one small nation can echo across continents. But let us not deceive ourselves. The road ahead is not smooth. Sanctions may still be sharpened. Disinformation may still flood our screens. Foreign interests may still return with softer words, but the same hunger. The battle for sovereignty is not won in a single confrontation. It is a struggle renewed in every generation. And so the question falls to us. What kind of world shall we build? One where contracts and threats define the destiny of nations, or one where dignity, equality, and sovereignty stand above profit and pressure? I ask you, my brothers and sisters watching today, if this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your spirit, do not let it end here. Share this message. Speak it in your homes, write it in your comments, and, above all, subscribe to this channel so that together we may keep alive the stories of courage the world too often tries to silence. Because in the end, sovereignty is not given, it is claimed. And once claimed, it can light a fire strong enough to guide a continent, strong enough to guide us all,